Hi everyone, welcome to Carbon Brief's first of our three Ask Us Any webinars during COP30. I'm Simon Evans, I'm the Deputy Editor and Senior Policy Editor at Carbon Brief. I'm joined here today by my colleagues Daisy Dunne, Josh Gabbatiss and Anika Patel, who are joining us from COP30 venue in Belém. Also Molly Lempriere in London and Aruna Chandrasekhar in Mumbai. Thanks to all of you for signing up for our COP30 Insider Pass. And many of you have already been sending in your questions to put to the team today. But if you'd like to ask a question, during the session today, please do submit them live via the Q&A function and at the bottom of the screen. We've got about an hour. We're gonna skip straight into the questions and dispense with the usual kind of intros, just so we can get through as many questions as we possibly can. And I think we've got a decent number of people through the door now, so we're just gonna kick off. And I'd like to start with a question from Chris Aylett for I'm going to put it to Anika, which is about China and what are their priorities coming into this COP?
Absolutely. Thank you, Simon, and thanks so much for the question, Chris. China, I think, has basically one big overarching priority that it's been messaging everywhere from its NDC to the 15th five-year plan recommendations that it put out about a month ago to the keynote speeches that Environment Minister Huang Wenqiu gave earlier today at the China Pavilion's opening ceremony, which is basically to make sure that in the absence of the US, there is still a meaningful signal sent from this COP that multilateralism is still important and that, even without the kind of driving force of perhaps US influence on the process, there can still be a meaningful consensus on climate action. It was really interesting today, actually, at the China Pavilion. The opening ceremony had speakers from the Chinese delegation, but also featured Simon Steele from the UNFCCC, Selwyn Hart, Inga Anderson from UNEP, and speakers as well from international NGOs from across the world. So really, to me, sending this kind of very strong signal that, there isn't, that China is really not pushing, or China is really pushing for a cohesive international voice on climate action. For me, another thing that's also quite interesting is how China is trying to ensure that there is still or that there is a greater economic narrative around the green transition. So especially compared to COP28, which I was on the ground for, and COP29, which our China section editor Wang Yuansong was at, I think there's a lot more narratives around just transitions, around kind of how the clean energy transition can translate into development and into economic growth. At the same time, I think we're going to see very similar kind of agenda fights around, for example, unilateral trade measures, a lot of messaging from the Chinese delegation on the need to avoid protectionism, trade tariffs, maybe carbon taxes, that kind of thing. And as noted in the Carbon Brief analysis of China's NDC, very little on China's expected tradition, or any kind of expectations around phasing down coal usage. But I think in general, the Chinese kind of delegation in statements it's been putting out recently has been very kind of clear that it's not necessarily pushing for a big headline flashy figure, but it wants the COP to show that the international consensus around climate action is still strong.
Thanks, Anika. Yeah, just what you mentioned, China's interest in putting a focus on economic potential of climate action. Just stuck a couple of things in the chat for everyone, including analysis we published at the start of this year showing that that clean energy sectors had contributed 10% of China's GDP in 2024 for the first time ever. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. So I'm going to throw this one to Josh, but if any of the rest of you would like to jump in, go for it. So we've been hearing a bit more this year about the so-called action agenda. So obviously we tend to focus at Carbon Brief particularly on the negotiations, but there's been an increasing role for the action agenda, which is the stuff that happens around the COP. Kind of big flashy pledges that countries sign up to. So yeah, a question here from Joe Hand. How do we expect the action agenda to manifest and play out at this COP?
Yeah, so thanks for that, Joe. Yeah, as Simon was saying, the action agenda is about these big flashy pledges, but I think it's taken on perhaps more significance at this COP because the Brazilian presidency has made it clear in the run-up that in making the COPs speak more to reality and sort of driving forward implementation, so making stuff happen in the real world, they want to kind of formalize and expand upon this action agenda, but without kind of, well, perhaps without just adding a load more new commitments, which is previously presidencies like the UK, for example, when the UK had the COP presidency, brought forward these flashy pledges. But I think an issue that some people have had with them is that often the pledges are made. There's a lot of press coverage at the time, but then perhaps there's not as much scrutiny following that. So, some of them get followed up on, some of them don't. With this one, the Brazilians have kind of based their action agenda plan around the global stocktake, which is something that countries negotiated in previous years, and there are already lots of big commitments that they've made towards expanding clean energy and that kind of thing. So they have set out. I can't remember the exact number, but it's 6 thematic areas, which are mitigation, adaptation, finance, a couple of other ones. And within that, there's 30 commitments that they have set out, and this achieves their vision for the action agenda. And then something is going to emerge, we hope, from this COP, which drives forward those existing pledges rather than sort of piling on a load of new ones. There are various events planned throughout the COP that involve bringing in lots of different organisations and relevant stakeholders besides governments, which of course it's governments doing the negotiations. But yeah, and then the idea, I think, is that this will create something which can give people confidence in the fact that the stuff that is happening at COPs is also playing out in real life. So this isn't, as Simon said, this isn't a negotiated outcome. So it kind of, for that reason, it's not subject to the kind of the issues that can plague negotiations in terms of countries blocking things they're not interested in, or that they oppose. So yeah. In terms of exactly how it will play out, I think we don't know exactly at this point, but certainly we know that the Brazilian presidency have made it very clear this is very important to them in letters, in various letters that the presidency has sent out building up to the COP. I know that there is, I can tell you, I've just walked around the conference venue and there is a big pavilion based around the action agenda, which is, I assume, where some of these events are going to take place. But I think we'll update you as the weeks progress. I don't know if anyone else wants to add something to that.
I think we've got millions of questions, so let's carry on. So we've got a question from Hassan Nasru bin Mod Kamil, and it's just a question, just what sort of an overview of the key negotiations that we're expecting to take place at COP30, main issues to be resolved and so on, predictions. I don't think we'll make any predictions about the COP, that's probably unwise. But yeah, I mean, well, one of the things that we've been sort of tracking that should hopefully get resolved, or at least kind of sorted out in some form or other today is what's called an agenda fight, where a bunch of countries have put forward proposals of things they want to add to the official agenda. So, for example, the like-minded group of developing countries, which includes places like China, India, Saudi Arabia, they've put in a couple of proposals. I might turn to Aruna in a moment just to run through those, because we've got some questions that are related to that. And then the Small Island Developing States, AOSIS, they've put forward a proposal to talk about the new climate pledges that countries have been making ahead of the COP. I believe we're now over 100 countries that have submitted new NDCs for 2035, of covering about 75% of global emissions. But even so, it's abundantly clear those don't bring us anywhere close to 1.5 degrees. So AOSIS wants to talk about that. There's also a proposal from the EU to talk about emissions reporting under the Paris Agreement. As of this year, for the first time, all countries are supposed to report much more regularly on their emissions and what they're doing to cut them. And a lot of countries haven't done that, so the EU wants to discuss that. But then, so we'll see how that agenda fight gets resolved. I'm sure that the presidency and others will come up with some smart way to work around that. But in terms of the actual negotiations, things that were already on the agenda, one of the really important outcomes from this COP is supposed to be on the global goal on adaptation. I'm just going to throw this over to Molly, our policy section editor, because I know that you've been following this closely.
Yeah, so the global goal on adaptation was agreed in the Paris Agreement, so 10 years ago nearly, but we've seen very little action on it for years following on from that. Then at COP29 last year, they launched what was called, they launched a specific work plan from Baku to Belém to try and come up with set indicators to measure progress on adaptation going forwards. One of the key things that we've had as a problem historically with adaptation is it's very locationally specific and exceptionally diverse in terms of what it actually looks like. So it's been tricky to measure whether or not countries or parties have been making any real progress. So they started with about 10,000 different potential indicators and an expert group of about 87 people. And over the course of the last year, they've been trying to whittle that down into 100. They have 100 as a list. Nominally, there are some sub-indicators within that. Possibly a little bit more flexibility than just strictly 100. But going into COP30, what they're going to try and do is get political consensus on that list. That would allow them going forwards to actively measure progress on adaptation. So after 10 years, that could be quite a big outcome, particularly considering the increasing focus on adaptation that we're seeing.
Thanks, Molly. We've also got some questions. I neglected to come back to the agenda issues that are being put forward by the like-minded group. So if I could just turn to Aruna now, could you maybe just run us through what the LMDCs want to talk about and where that might end up appearing on the agenda?
Thanks, Simon. I think the LMDCs are keen on the inclusion of two items on the agenda. One is Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, which deals with developed countries providing finance to developing countries and how that fits in. And in terms of the second item that they've been asking about has been the inclusion of a dedicated place to talk about unilateral trade measures. And as Anika has discussed, this also deals with measures such as CBAM. It talks about trade and tariffs. Where will this find space? It has found space in an area that called response measures, kind of neglected part of negotiations, which has traditionally been seen as a sort of staging ground for different kinds of disputes, which have never been fully resolved. But it also gained space last year to have some sort of discussion or dedicated space to talk about this. But to have this officially included in the agenda is a call from the LMDCs. Now, also on Article 9.1, the LMDCs want to put the focus not just on developed countries' obligation to provide finance, not just towards 300 billion that was agreed in Baku, of course, that coming from a variety of different sources, not the outcome that they expected, but also for the aspirational 1.3 trillion. And of course, we had seen 5 days before the COP, the Baku to Belém roadmap being released. We haven't seen countries having the opportunity to respond to it. We may hear some of that in the plenary or down the line or in high-level sort of event. But yeah, this is something that the LMDCs want to see included. And yeah, want to see how long the agenda fight goes on and where this gets included in the end.
Thanks, Aruna. Also, we've got a question from Nuri Osberger Datley about unilateral trade measures and whether that might feature in the Just Transition work programme agenda item. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as well.
I think that it's an interesting one where, of course, it applies to both, and countries are keen to see it. Of course, Molly would also want to comment on that, but whichever both platforms are spaces where this has been brought up and where this eventually ends up will be important to see as well as track. They found a seat in response measures, but including it in the Just Transition work program will mean that it's front and center in the agenda, and maybe that might be the additional compromise that could bring the weight down.
Thanks, Aruna. Molly, you can add to that if you want.
Yeah, just to note that in the Bonn climate talks in June, unilateral trade measures was put into the Just Transition work programme discussions. It was a sticking point in the agenda at that when they were trying to get the discussions underway in June, and is likely to be wherever it lands again in Belém. It was a sticking point as discussions and negotiations got underway within the 2 weeks negotiations on the Just Transition work programme, but so were a huge number of other things, in particular finance, and exactly sort of what it will end up looking like. So if it ends up in the Just Transition work programme again, and not in response measures, it will likely be a sticking point, but it won't be the biggest of them. So we're likely to still see relative consensus on a Just Transition work programme going forwards.
Thanks, Molly. Now we've got a number of questions that I'm going to try and pull together on the sort of elephant in the room, proverbially. One from Bärbel Winkler about the risk of the Trump regime trying to subvert progress at COP30, even if they're not present. Daniel Ospina, also asking how might the administration torpedo COP30. And Sonia Shah similarly asking about the absence of the US and a potential COP leadership vacuum. I don't know if any of you feel like volunteering to take that question on. I mean, as far as I understand it, like there isn't a US delegation. I mean, we haven't had official confirmation yet of the delegations published by the UNFCCC. So yeah, I guess we'll be able to confirm for sure. But I don't know if you guys that have been actually in Belém have got any intel on that. I don't know if Josh, Daisy, or Anika want to come in.
I haven't seen them. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have any insights beyond that. There's definitely a kind of I can't remember the official term for them, but the sort of coalition of like states and governors, NGOs, people like that who come to represent the US unofficially. I don't know if Ross was talking.
Yeah, just to add, because I was following this kind of issue at COP29, and we did see just it being mentioned a lot in the negotiations, but I think we'll have to wait a bit of time for that kind of plays out. It's definitely something we're keeping an eye on.
Just gonna note quickly that America is all in. which is the sort of group of governors and stuff, are hosting a side event on Tuesday, led by Gavin Newsom, the Californian governor. And they've got quite a few sort of relatively big names involved in it, and it is to effectively position the US as still involved in the conversations, and that lots of people still want climate action, and not to judge the whole of the US by its presidency, I think is the idea. But yeah, in terms of an official delegation, I don't think that's the same.
Yeah, also just wanting to add, like for instance, for the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, that again, where the US does send its delegation to observe, they may not be in the closed door meetings, but they are listening and they are observing, and they do have an influence. So yeah, I expect wait and watch. But yeah, I think the overwhelming influence of them not being there, and of naming that, and where that leaves new alliances or people stepping up in their absence, I think it needs to be watched and seen.
Cool. Thanks all of you. And it's worth adding, like, people sort of immediately assumed after the election last November that there would be a big impact on COP29. And I think what I remember finding quite striking in Baku was the extent to which countries were just struggling and getting on with it. I mean, I know we're in a bit of a different place a year on, but I think there is a critical mass of countries wanting to try and demonstrate through this COP that multilateralism and climate action still have an important role to play. Good. Okay, we're going to move on to another question. So Catherine Harrison's asked about the commitment to transitioning away from fossil fuels, which was part of the global stocktake outcome at COP28 in Dubai. And Catherine's asking how will this be revisited at the COP, and if so, in which agenda item? So I can kind of have a go at answering that. I think this is one of the issues that's slightly up in the air. So technically on the agenda, there's something called the UAE Stocktake Dialogue, which they were supposed to have agreed last year in Baku. And this is meant to be some sort of dialogue taking forwards the outcome of the global stocktake. But in the closing plenary last year, it was kind of torpedoed at the last minute, effectively because the outcome that had been negotiated, the text that they were presented with in the closing plenary, was incredibly weak. And so a series of negotiating groups stuck their hands up and said, we don't think this represents consensus. And so the COP presidency last year basically had to say, well, there's no consensus on this matter and we're going to pass it forward. So technically that would be the place where transitioning away might be negotiated at COP30. I think there's big question marks over how substantive those discussions are going to be, simply because the positions that led to the disagreement last year are still very much entrenched. Effectively, there's a group of countries that want the stocktake dialogue only to be about climate finance, effectively. And then there's another group of countries that want the stocktake dialogue to take in the entirety of the stocktake outcome. So transitioning away from fossil fuels, the whole kind of energy transition part of the stocktake outcome, as well as climate finance, adaptation, loss and damage, blah, blah, blah. So barring a kind of real change of heart from those groups, which is quite hard to see, I'm not quite sure how much we're going to see in terms of transitioning away. I suppose it's possible that there might be some sort of cover text that the Brazilians might try and put together to capture some of those conversations, and also the stuff around 1.5 degrees, the lack of sufficient ambition in the latest NDCs and so on. But that remains to be seen. It's another thing we'll be watching closely. So we've got a question about from Sam Bickersteth. Any sense of likely outcomes on climate finance and how the LDCs and others will respond to continuing disappointments? And we've got a related question from Sonia Shah about barriers that might prevent the 1.3 trillion sort of aspirational goal for climate finance being materialized. Josh, probably turn to our climate finance expert if you can.
Sure. So, I mean, the first thing to say is, this isn't a climate finance COP in the sense that last year we had the new climate finance goal was the big outcome from last year's COP, the big sort of headline outcome. This year there aren't big negotiating tracks or outcomes expected to do with climate finance, but it still sort of pervades everything because developing countries like the LDCs say that they need climate finance if they're going to do any of the other stuff that they are required to do, such as adapt to climate change. So, as we've seen already, with even just deciding on the agenda, the question of climate finance is essential and can disrupt things. We've got the LNDCs wanting an agenda item on Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, which is to do with requiring developed countries to provide climate finance. So this is to do with essentially in this climate of countries cutting their aid budgets, the US withdrawing pretty much all its aid. They're basically saying we need more commitment from developed countries to continue providing climate finance. So not private finance, particularly, more like public funds provided as grants, preferably. Anyway, so in terms of the actual outcome from this COP, I mean, it will sort of pervade everything, and it will be part of the adaptation discussions that Holly was talking about earlier, because adaptation finance is really important, and countries say that particularly adaptation finance needs lots of public money because it's hard to mobilize private finance to pay for climate adaptation. So potentially it could be part of those discussions. In terms of getting an agenda item on Article 9.1, I'm not sure about that, but that is also part in play. And there was also it's worth noting there was also the Baku to Belém roadmap, which was launched last week, just before as the COP started. And this is to do with this relates to the second question, which is to do with raising climate finance to $1.3 trillion a year. So this was there were two climate finance targets agreed last year. One with the sort of central 300 billion a year by 2035, and the secondary one was 1.3 trillion. And this second one is more kind of aspirational. The first one is primarily targeted at it's saying that developed countries should be primarily responsible for providing that money. But the 1.3 trillion is kind of opening up to everyone. And specifically, I mean, people have been talking about the private sector, so getting lots more money from the private sector. So, the Baku Development Roadmap was launched, but I mean, it's not part of the negotiations. Countries didn't want it to be part of the negotiations, really. I mean, particularly developed countries weren't keen on reopening everything that they decided last year, especially in this new context where, the US isn't giving any money anymore, and most of Europe is massively scaling back their climate aid contributions. So, in terms of kind of what the outcome will be, I mean, I think it will inevitably just be part of lots of different negotiating tracks. It will be a key thing that sways what countries do, but don't expect a kind of big outcome like we had last year. And in terms of how LDCs will respond, I mean, doubtless they will be disappointed by the lack, I mean, of the kind of climate finance that they want, but they'll continue pushing for it nonetheless. Lots of different tracks.
Thanks, Josh. So we've got just so you know, we've got squillions of questions. We're definitely not going to get through them all, but we'll do our best. So we've got a question from Gomez Boga about the voices of Indigenous peoples and how well represented they are at the COP. I don't know if any of you that are there feel able to answer that, or if Aruna, you feel like you could say anything about that. I'm not sure I know the answer to that.
Happy for Daisy to come in, but yes, there's a strong Indigenous caucus. There's also lots of Indigenous organizations, but also wanted to mention the fact that, of course, this COP has been quite expensive in terms of affordability. There are serious concerns about whether various groups can afford to make it there. Many of us couldn't make it there. So it speaks to issues around accessibility. How are people going to be able to travel and meaningfully participate? In terms of meaningful participation, I think the CBD, that is the Biological Diversity COP, Indigenous groups and voices have a much stronger influence. In fact, they managed to establish a subsidiary body to look at Indigenous actions, to increase both participation and have a direct voice over biodiversity actions, as well as, under the agreement. So yeah, I would say the CBD COP is where Indigenous voices are much stronger compared to the UNFCCC. But hopefully, I mean, there are thematic days and there will be things and there will be launches. And I think especially now with initiatives such as, the various carbon market launches, with the amount of private sector involvement that is talking about keeping forests standing, while also ensuring that communities are involved. You can expect groups, especially in the region, who've been able to make it, to have strong things to say about that.
Thanks, Aruna. Now, I wanted to just turn to a question we've got in the Q&A, which I don't know if you've been tracking this in relation to the COP, Anika, but there's a question about things to look out for in relation to critical minerals for the energy transition during this COP. I know it's something you've been tracking quite closely in relation to our China coverage.
Thanks, Simon. I think from the China perspective, I haven't seen a huge amount specifically, although I did note that a representative from Greenpeace dropped a really excellent report in response in the chat. So I encourage everyone to take a look at that. I think that really where critical minerals will come up is in discussions around green protectionism. I think that right now, I think that kind of China's main aim with its critical minerals trade is just to make sure that flows of not necessarily the minerals themselves, but the products they're needed for are relatively unobstructed. But I'm not necessarily sure that that's the delegation's main focus at this COP.
Just one minor point to add on that. G77 in China, the umbrella group, did put forward a call for critical minerals and access to them to fall under the scope of the Just Transition Work Programme this year. Exactly what that will look like is still slightly unclear, but it seems likely that we'll see critical minerals pop up within those negotiations.
Thanks, Molly. Now we've got a number of questions about geoengineering. One from Lee Morris and one from Jeff Souchon, asking about solar radiation management, and Manjima and Jana asking about carbon dioxide removal. Daisy, I don't know if you want to say what you're expecting to see in Belém in relation to these issues.
Sure, thanks, and thanks for the question. So I'll talk about carbon dioxide removal first, I suppose. It's never really featured that much in negotiations in past COPs. It's kind of spoken about in relation to carbon markets or to tree planting and deforestation, that kind of thing. This time at this COP, there is a carbon dioxide removal pavilion for the first time. So there should be more kind of events and panels taking place that's sort of outside of negotiations on that. In terms of solar geoengineering, again, it's also not really featured that heavily, especially in the negotiations at climate COPs. It actually features quite a lot more, I would say, at the biodiversity COPs, the CBD COPs, where there is actually a sort of de facto ban on the large-scale deployment of solar geoengineering, which was agreed by countries and reaffirmed at the last COP that took place in Colombia. But yeah, those are my reflections on that.
Thanks, Daisy. Now we've got a question from Dermot Williamson, noting that according to the World Meteorological Organization, there were record greenhouse gas emissions in 2024. And then they sort of ask, following on from that, how much faith we can place in kind of projections of global warming this century as a result of nationally determined contributions. So Daisy, I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit. You look quite closely at some of the NDCs as they were coming in this year.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so this year's been quite an important year for NDCs. So in February, there was a deadline for countries to submit their new NDCs, and carbon brief analysis showed that 95% of countries missed this. And then there was a kind of expectation that countries would come up with their new NDCs ahead of COP30. And around a third of countries either announced their NDCs or announced their targets that would like feature their NDCs. So these were able to be analysed for NDC synthesis report that was put out just before COP. And that found that emissions are on the downward for the first time according to these plans. But of course, because only a third of countries have put the plans forward, it's quite hard to draw their conclusions. So I guess you might have further thoughts to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Daisy. So so the emissions gap report also came out last week, looking at the impact of the new pledges. But that again, it was only those pledges that had been announced or published as of the end of September. So I think it was about covering about 2/3 of emissions at that time. It did include China and the EU, and they basically found that if we only think about countries' current policies, there's a 2/3 chance we'll keep warming below 2.8 degrees this century. That is down by a few fractions of a degree since their projection last year. And then they said if all of the NDCs were implemented in full, then you kind of shave another half of a degree off expected warming. And then in the kind of most optimistic scenario where all countries meet all of their pledges, including net zero targets, then warming would be limited to 1.9 degrees. I mean, in relation to how reliable are those projections? I mean, of course, they're subject to significant uncertainties around, how sensitive the climate is to emissions, what sort of feedbacks, we might encounter, and the extent to which countries actually implement their policies or not. But they're the best projections that we have at the moment. I'm now going to turn to a question about participation. So I think there was a question about the kind of notable absences at the Leaders Summit last week, but also some questions from Yengi Justine Anne-Claire Poirier about the official list of participants. So we know who was at the Leaders Summit last week. And we know that the world's three biggest emitters didn't send their heads of state or government. We know that the kind of participation in the Leaders Summit was significantly weaker than say ahead of the Paris Agreement 10 years ago. But in terms of the delegations and the countries that will be participating in the negotiations as of this week and next week, we don't know for sure what that looks like because the official kind of participant list hasn't been published yet. But Carbon Brief will be doing some analysis of that list as soon as it comes out. So keep an eye out on our website, and we'll be able to update you all then. Then we've got a couple of questions that's sort of loosely related to agriculture and the land sector, so both anonymous. What's the lookout for the agriculture sector in this year's COP? And are there specific negotiations in relation to methane mitigation? Aruna, I don't know if you can answer that, please.
Agriculture is again very much in your action agenda, everything happening outside of not huge outcomes expected in the negotiating tracks, where, of course, last year's at COP29 was mostly about an online portal and, trying to help people pitch their projects for different kinds of funding. Of course, agriculture is going to be very much in the list of adaptation indicators that get agreed on at the end of the year. There's also Brazil that is reportedly pushing countries to sign up to a pledge to quadruple the use of sustainable fuels, including biofuels. A couple of outlets have reported on this, including The Guardian and Bloomberg, which is going to be an interesting one to see. Brazil is the world's second largest producer of biofuels. Its entire concept of a bioeconomy also looks at biofuel usage, but at the same time, its climate effects as well as benefits are contested and differ widely from region to region. India is also seems to be on board with Brazil's plan. It has also ramped up its biofuel production. So yeah, I think that would be one to watch. And looking at agribusiness, of course, forests have been all in the news. And of course, discussions on methane. I think my colleague Ola has also done a really great piece on the GWP star and its metrics and what that means for climate. So I urge you all to, follow along and read that piece.
Thanks for that, Aruna. We've got a couple of questions which I'm going to put to Daisy about who's going to host COP31. So obviously, Australia and Turkey are both saying that they want to host COP31 next year. Ugo Engelhardt says, is there any sense yet of which of them is going to win? And Benito Muller is also wondering if there's any intel on that sort of UN grouping, Western Europe and others group, which is a bit of a strange one that somehow includes Europe and Australia. Daisy, I think you picked up some intel on this earlier. What can you tell us?
Thanks for the question. So earlier today, I bumped into somebody from the Australia delegation who gave me an update that really talks between Australia and Turkey sort of stalled on who will host the summit. He also told me there's no kind of official procedure to follow for when countries can't agree on who should host COP. So that's why there's no technical solution, which means that we're likely to not really hear of any kind of new update officially until week 2, potentially at the end of week 2, when ministers arrive and take up the issues that remain outstanding. So yeah, we're not likely to do anything for at least another week.
Thanks, Daisy. Yeah, it's certainly not the first time that we've seen we've seen disputes over who's going to be the host. Like Azerbaijan, for example, was a last minute decision. I think it was between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and then somehow got pulled out of the hat at the last minute in Egypt, as I remember. But obviously it means limited time for the host country to prepare if they only have a year as opposed to a longer run up. Okay, let's move on. So we've got some questions about the Tropical Forest Forever facility, which I think I finally remember how to recite. So Finn Ryler asks, is it really a game changer for funding rainforest protection? How's it different from past efforts? And Miriam Pris Hansen asks, does it matter for broad acceptance that the TFFF has been mentioned in the BRICS Summit Declaration in July? Aruna, you did a really great explainer on the TFFF that we published last week. What can you tell us?
What I can say is, of course, the TFFF has been really talked up for its what they're calling an innovative financing mechanism, but seems like it rests a lot on interest rates giving and continuing to just keep giving in ways that are predictable when we know that markets don't work that way. And it relies on a very large investment pool, which can be both in terms of loans, it could also be grants, it could also be concession funding coming from sponsor countries. Of course, now we've seen Brazil and Indonesia give massive amounts, and we've also seen some countries haven't fully announced their contribution despite being keenly involved in the TFFF, such as the UK as well as France. Seen Norway putting out its pledge. But yeah, it relies on this funding from sponsor countries to attract 100 billion in private investors, and counting on this to be able to generate returns and pay investors back. So the fund prioritizes investors, and eventually the difference between what they get back and that difference is what is paid to countries and goes towards $4 a hectare of keeping standing forest standing. Minus, of course, fees and otherwise. To me, it seems it's interesting. We have also seen things like debt for nature swaps. We're seeing biodiversity offsets. We've seen all different kinds of funds. And it looks innovative, but it at the same time it is quite laden with risk, and it looks like it might be juggling debt. And if that is the best way to keep forest standing, then and if that is what we can come up with, it seems to be going down a trend of looking towards the private sector to solve things that might need much more spine from countries themselves.
Thanks, Aruna. Yeah, as worth saying, we spoke to some finance experts last week about the TFFF, and there's unfortunately off the record, so we can't say who it was, but they were pretty scathing about the prospects of this, effectively being financial engineering that wouldn't, over the long term would not produce any returns. And that, effectively you would be tying the fate of forests to interest rates not falling, and that if interest rates fell, then the trees would fall. So that wasn't too promising, but anyway, we shall see. Now, let's see. We've got a question from John de Jong about prospects for progressing Article 6. So, I mean, Article 6, in theory, has all been wrapped up as of last year. And I know some of the negotiators in the Article 6 world have been saying for the first time they might be able to see the sunrise and the sunset from their hotel rooms. Of course, COP often doesn't work like that, so I'm not quite sure how things will progress. I know there's been some quite sort of heated discussions in the supervisory body that looks after the Article 6.4 kind of crediting mechanism. It's basically the new CDM under the Paris Agreement for an international carbon markets. There's been lots of discussion there about nature-based solutions versus carbon dioxide removal, and what role for kind of impermanent sources of carbon removal, i.e. things like trees. Aruna, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, but I think there's definitely some scope for there to be some fruity negotiations there.
It doesn't look like, there is an annual synthesis report of looking at some of those cooperative approaches and how they worked. But I think we can expect to see a lot of deals being struck and carbon markets being launched. And those are ones to watch out for. And I think they might be done on specific thematic days. So I think COP30 will be more of a destination to see some of those deals being struck. And yeah.
Great, thanks, Aruna. We've got a question about nature at the COP. How are negotiators ensuring that biodiversity commitments are fully integrated into climate decisions, not kind of taking place in parallel? I don't know if Aruna or Daisy want to try and answer that.
There's been a call by different countries looking for synergies between all three Rio conventions. And I think we've compiled some of those in Who Wants What section of our piece. But looking for greater synergies between the UNFCCC, the Biodiversity COP, and the Land Degradation and Desertification COP, saying that we shouldn't be doubling up both in terms of reporting and also in terms of efforts, and how do you make finance make sense and ensure that stuff is also not double counted. So it's interesting to see some of the country, some of those responses. But yeah, Daisy?
Yeah, just to add, I think there was kind of talk about this COP being the nature COP and kind of having nature at its core, and I guess the location and the TFFF are signs of that. I mean, Brazil is the most biodiverse region in the world as well. And I remember I spoke to people from the presidency at COP29 from the Brazilian presidency, and they said they were going to work closely with the Colombian presidency of COP16, the most recent biodiversity COP, to ensure that nature is a major feature at these talks. So I think along with the kind of the interactions between the Rio conventions, we may see some kind of non-negotiated pledges and that kind of thing, and I'll definitely keep following it.
Thanks, Daisy. We've got a question from Rob Macquarie, just asking for a bit more detail on the Just Transition work programme and to what extent we might see some sort of tangible directions for policy coming out of that this year. Molly, can you have a go at that?
Yeah, sure. So at COP29 last year, the Just Transition Work Programme couldn't reach agreement, and there was an agreed text at the end of it. So I think everyone's hoping there's a little bit more progress that happens this year. And right from the very beginning of Delago's presidency letters, we've had a lot more focus on just transition and how that's key to the Brazilian presidency and a key outcome that they want. So parties are hoping to establish an international mechanism for just transition, and that would sort of help to actually operationalize a lot of the sort of agreed UNFCCC just transition principles that we've seen. There's still quite a few areas where we can see sticking points. We mentioned previously stuff around unilateral trade measures and finance, but also lots of things kind of get lumped in together in the just transition conversation. So also things around fossil fuels, and you get a quite sort of broad strokes, developed countries wanting to have a conversation about how to do a workers' transition predominantly focused on the fossil fuel sector, and then developing countries wanting to talk about a more holistic transition that takes everyone in society along in a just way. And that has historically caused problems and stalled conversations quite a lot of the time. So those could still be sticking points, but in general, people seem to be quite optimistic about coming up with a mechanism at the end of it. Even things, I talked to someone in Bonn who was saying that they'd been given the nice rooms and they'd been given the sort of nice social hours in which to discuss things, and the little things like that, not being the last people to debate and negotiate right at the very end of the day, made a huge difference in terms of progress. So yeah, in terms of what issues we can see coming out of the Just Transition work programme, but also what would be a kind of tangible outcome, that mechanism would be key.
Great, thanks, Molly. Got a question from Shibo Liu about what we could expect in terms of aviation and maritime decarbonisation from this COP. Josh, do you want to speak to that?
The honest answer is I don't know. I think the answer is probably nothing. I don't think we expect anything specific to come out on those topics. It might be worth mentioning that this COP follows after a collapse of talks at the International Maritime Organization in London, which happened just a few weeks ago, where essentially a new framework for getting the global shipping industry to net zero was expected to be waved through. And because of disruption led by the US and also some other countries, including Saudi Arabia, I believe, the whole thing was delayed. So that, I mean, those talks are important because the global shipping industry is, I forget the exact percentage, but it's maybe 2% of global emissions.
More
and
than
that
most
is a
countries,
rare,
sure.
that's a, right. And that's a rare venue in which countries can agree on an outcome, which to decarbonise the entire industry. I mean, that's very rare. And it was looking to be a really positive climate story, and it's largely been sunk by the Trump administration and others. So I suppose there's a kind of a bad vibe on that coming into this COP, and it feeds into a broader narrative around issues with multilateralism. But in terms of actual sort of negotiated outcomes from this COP on those sectors, I don't think we're expecting anything.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from Jeff Souchon about Belém and the area after COP, and will there be more deforestation there? I mean, people that are joining from around the world and that maybe aren't actually in Belém might be quite interested to hear your reflections. I mean, maybe Daisy, if you want to give us a sense of what it's like there.
Yeah, sure. So what can I tell you about the venue so far? I think we can see that there's been some kind of regeneration of Belém to support the summit. So just things like a lot of the businesses and like roads around the conference centre look quite like they've been newly decorated. So I guess that's a positive sign of regeneration of the area. So far, we've been able to access the venue, access Wi-Fi, all that kind of stuff, which has been positive as well. Josh, do you have any reflections on that?
I mean, the COP venue I think there was a lot of reporting ahead of time about, which I'm sure a lot of you have read about the lack of preparation, lack of accommodation, things like that. We have had our own issues with that that I won't go into. But in terms of the venue itself, they are still kind of putting it together a bit. Pavilions where countries have sort of hold discussions and things like that are still very much under construction. I went around earlier and a lot of them are just completely empty or not built yet. So I don't know what that says really about the COP, but I think broadly speaking, it seems to be going well.
Great. So we're nearly finished, but we might just finish with a last question from Wolfgang Blau, which I might pass around and give you each maybe 30 seconds if you can. So COPs are always good for a surprise. From an optimistic yet realistic point of view, what could some of these surprises look like this year? So I mean, I'll start and say that some sort of outcome, formal outcome of negotiations reflecting the sort of ambition gap towards 1.5, that seems possible. Would be quite surprising since it's not expected, but could happen. Aruna, do you want to go next?
I thought I might need time to think about something optimistic, but in a time of of where there are big questions around multilateralism and where we're heading, and in where ambition related to finance, one not really coming through. If this manages to result in leadership and, of course, a way forward and a home for having these discussions, and that's not something that people give up on. To me, that is really optimistic. And that's mine.
Great, thank you. Anika?
For me, I think one thing I was a little bit pessimistic about until the kind of leaders summit and this last weekend was prospects for China-Europe cooperation. I felt that there was a lot of kind of effort to kind of maintain some sort of dialogue, but maybe not a lot of outcomes. For me, I think looking at a summit that just happened on the weekend and a couple of statements, I'm a little bit more tentatively optimistic that there might be some actual some kind of like traction in the negotiations between China and Europe. And so a nice surprise would be, some sort of synergy in terms of something around climate finance or even just climate ambition and emissions mitigation. But I think we'll have.
Thanks, Anika. Josh, Molly, and Daisy, do you want to try and say something extremely quickly as we're almost out of time?
Should I go first? Very quickly, a new target or a new agreement on adaptation finance that was goal set in COP26 that ends in 2025. So seeing some more progress on that would be optimistic, but good to see.
Thanks.
I would say a negotiated outcome around tackling biodiversity loss and climate change together would be a nice approach.
Thanks, Daisy and Josh.
Yeah, an action agenda that does what the presidency has been talking about and doesn't just pile on a load of new promises, but sets a course to something constructive.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much to all of the Carbon Brief team, and thanks very much to you for joining us. The hour is now definitively up, so thanks for your questions. If we have time later, we might try and drop some answers to further unanswered questions into our Insider Pass WhatsApp group. Just to let you know, our second Ask Us Anything webinar will be taking place at the same time next week, Monday, 3 p.m. UK time. We'll be looking at how things are standing midway through, and holders of the Inside Pass will get an exclusive invite to that webinar in their inboxes later this week. If you've got any other questions in the meantime, please email us cop30@carbonbrief.org. Finally, thanks once again, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.